We'll now move on to the next session, so I'll ask Felix and Jan Gustav to silence, and we'll give the floor over to Lida on the role of stakeholders in UNEP and UNEA. Lida, over to you.
Yes, thank you. We just listened on what UNEP UNEA is doing, so it is very important what our role and our entry points are in those processes. But I think first of all, I would like to explain a little bit the upgrade from UNEP to UNEA. It's not on the slide, but I think it's important to know because I see still a lot of confusion there. When we had UNEP that was upgraded in a resolution, in the Rio Plus 20 to UNEA, we went from a program also to an assembly. So that means that we have not only UNEP as a program, but also the UN Environmental Assembly. The difference is that UNEP as a program was executing programs, as it said, funded by member states, etc. There was a governing body where decisions were made, but mostly on the program. So it's mostly about the implementation of several things to be executed in the countries or in the regions. UNEA is an assembly, so that means that all the countries are member. It's also more political. It's really more about setting out the agenda, principles and things, even conventions, etc. So it's, I think, for NGOs that are doing advocacy work, it's a really the place to be because it's, you have your contact with the member states and where the decisions are made related to the environmental issues and sustainability issues. There is, of course, that was already decided in Rio in '92 that major groups of civil society, stakeholders, they do have a role in all these kind of processes and also in the implementation of the programs. When we talk about stakeholders, NGOs, social movements, civil society, there are not really clear definitions on what it is. Civil society tends to be very heterogeneous. You have social movements, which are groups of people that are often fighting a specific political or social issue. You have stakeholders, which is a kind of definition of everybody who is at stake, so who has impact for a decision or can make an impact on a decision. Civil society is a kind of aggregate of all the NGOs and institutions, etc. We exclude there the academics, researchers, universities, local governments, because they are, let's say, part of a government, official, and foundations. Foundations we see as foundations that are funders for several NGOs or groups or social movements. It is important if you want to be active in global processes that you feel a kind of global citizenship, so that you put your own interest on a higher ambition, which is the global or the common interest of the planet and everything that is on it. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. As in mostly all the UN bodies, the accreditation process is focused on NGOs. So you have an accredited NGO process, you can be accredited. But even within the NGOs, you have several organizations. There is also not really one definition on what is an NGO. You have the bingos, which we call the big international NGOs, that can be WWF, BirdLife. You have several really big NGOs. You have the bongos, which is the business organized NGOs. You have private sector. They often also create an NGO, which is a kind of defending the interests of the industry. So you have the International Mining Network. It's all big mining companies, but they also have their own NGO. It seems an NGO, so looking at the bigger picture and the common interest of let's say our planet and the people and animals on it. But it's really defending the business interests. So you have to be careful on what kind of NGO you're dealing with. You have the community-based organizations, which are grassroots organizations, etc. As I said, civil society organizations are quite broad. Within UNEA, they sometimes also seem to differentiate the environmental NGOs. I think it's a little bit outdated because I don't think you have a lot of NGOs that are only working on environment. It's often already in a bigger or broader picture on sustainability, etc. You also have also an NGO, a type of NGO you have to take care of, which is the governmental organized NGO. So some countries, it's not so evident or not so obvious to have your own NGO with free speech, etc. So you have NGOs that are mostly dominated by the government and also speak the language of that government. And that's what we call the gongos. Can you push the button twice? Yeah. So in short, there is no agreed terminology for describing an NGO. It's easier to say what they are not. So it's not a part of the government, and it's also not organized primarily for private profit. It's really an NGO that is, an NGO is an organization that works for the common good. Next one. Next slide. Yeah. In Agenda 21, they differentiate 9 major groups. As I said, most of all the organizations being part of a major group are, let's say, in a sense, an NGO, apart from the local authorities and business and industry. So you have 9 major groups. We have women, children and youth, farmers, NGOs, indigenous people, workers and trade unions, science and technology, local authority, business and industry. So 9 major groups. In the Rio process, because it was also mentioned in the Rio Plus 20 outcome, that it was changed into major groups and other stakeholders, because some groups felt not really be part of one of the major groups, and that's why they created not other major groups, because it was too complicated and also opening a box of Pandora if you start to discuss the existence of the 9 major groups and why not other major groups. The political context can be in that way that we end up with less major groups. So that's why they decided, okay, we keep with the 9 major groups and we put other stakeholders. In the Rio process, you see that the elderly people, people with disabilities, managed to be kind of accepted as other stakeholder. The same for multi-sectoral networks that cover more than one major groups. In the Rio process, we had the Beyond 2015 network, which was NGOs, trade unions, and farmers, etc. So they also managed to have a kind of own seat within the whole process, or an own say in the whole process. At UNEA, we don't see that much, not yet. So there we still work with mostly with the 9 major groups, and the other stakeholders are getting part of the NGO major group. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Lida. We now have another poll.
Okay.
So I'm gonna pop that up for a moment, and we'll come back to you. Let me launch it. Okay, we're going to stop sharing that. We go on to the next poll. Okay, as you can see, of the 9 member groups, I'd like to ask the participants to please make a choice of which of the 9 major groups you are a part of. And we'll let that go for a few moments until we get, we're getting some good results. Okay, we've got about 60% of our participants have voted. I'm going to give it another 15 seconds and then I will end it and share it. Thank you very much. I will share. If one of the panelists can let me know, are you seeing the shared results?
Yes.
Very good. pardon me while I just, I'm also going to try to save it now while you're all seeing it. So bear with me just a moment. Okay. Well, thank you for that. Interesting. There we have quite a diversity, but in this particular group, no one from workers and trade unions. But we'll share those polls with you when we share other information. In the meantime, Lyda, back to you.
Okay, thanks. So next slide. It was funny to see that there were not trade unions and workers in this meeting, and also not indigenous people, but maybe that's normal for Europe, although in part of Europe we still have indigenous people groups. Anyhow, so how are we organized as major groups? As I said, we have 9 major groups. Within UNEA, UNEP, we have a major group facilitating committee elected by accredited organizations for a 2-year term. UNEA is also every 2 years, so that's why we have every UNEA. I mean, in the ideal situation, we have every UNEA another major group facilitating committee, and the election process is organized by the major group itself. It's facilitated by UNEP, but let's say it's a totally self-organized process. It's very important to know that all the major groups have to organize themselves. They have to see how they communicate with their constituencies, etc., etc. The major group facilitating committee therefore has 18 people, so 2 people of the 9 major groups. Often it's someone from the south, from the north, a man and a woman. We also have our regional meetings. I will come back later on that, later in this capacity building. And there they elect regional facilitators. It's 2 representatives per region. We have 6 regions, so that's why we have 12 regional facilitators. It's also often a man and woman. In Europe, it's someone from Western Europe and Eastern Europe, because Europe is not the European Union. It's broader. It's the continent of Europe, which is, of course, much broader. It's one of the UNEC. It's the UNECE region, let's say. But they have an observer status. This group, it's 18 plus 12, so it's 30 people. They have regular meetings, etc. So if you are from a major group, women, NGOs, or whatever, it's very important to know who is your representative, who is also your regional facilitator. So those are the persons that are responsible for disseminating all the information and all the things that are happening, also facilitating our major group in having joint positions, in having, I mean, being aware of where we can be, where we can participate in all kind of other things that are happening, even within the, I mean, the questions that I saw before on how we can be involved in the geo, how can we be involved in all kind of other things. So it's very important to have contact with those people. They have there's also a civil society unit at UNEP. The name was already mentioned. It's Alexander Juras who is the responsible for that, but we also have a lot of contact with Leticia and Aurora. I mean, they are there working for us. They are not, let's say, doing the same thing as the facilitators of the major group facilitating committee, because it's really, it's more the logistics. I mean, they give us the technical issues. They send out the emails, which is mostly on the process, very technical, while the major groups, of course, also have to go more into the content, so that we have joint positions, that we have discussions on what's on the agenda. Next slide, please. As major groups or as NGO, civil society, we have to be involved in many processes. Being engaged with UNEA 5 in this case It's not enough to travel to Nairobi in February and be there for 2 weeks and look what's happening. I mean, if you really want to be engaged and involved, you have to do your homework, as we say. UNEA 5 already started. I mean, the process already started. So we already had a lot of meetings where it was important. I don't know if you were there. Important to be there and be involved so that you can be part of the agenda. We have also regional consultations, as I said. The UNECE RCM, Regional Consultation Meeting, will be soon. I don't think there is a date yet, but it will be somewhere in October, November, so be updated there as well to be part of that as well. We also have, within the major groups, we have the thematic clusters. It is important to know. Please look for your representative. It's on the website of UNEP, of your major group, so that you know how your major group is organized, because not all the major groups are organized in the same way. It is important for our region also to coordinate our inputs in the CPR and the UNEA 5 bureaus. It's always more, let's say, powerful if we can organize our positions instead of having so many NGOs saying more or less the same thing. So it's always good to have and work with your regional coordinator, representative, to have joint meetings or joint positions as well. There is the international consultation, the CPR in October, and there is always opportunities to have be part of the online consultations as well. If you cannot attend to all the meetings, which I understand, then it's also good to ask your representative to have your points or your things also appointed and mentioned in the joint position, and have them uploaded in their on the website as well. There is a huge platform for all inputs from the major groups, a separate section where you can upload or let your documents uploaded over there. So as I said, every individual major group has its own consultations. Therefore, it's again important that you know who is your representative. They also run their own preparatory meetings and things. Some major groups are more active than others. Some are more, let's say, they are more democratic than others, more open, transparent than others. I mean, some are quite, like the trade unions, for instance, they have their structure as trade unions and workers. So they have few people that are following those UN processes. And those people have the mandate to do it. And therefore, you also see that local trade unions or regional or national trade unions are not always very active in this kind of processes. So that's quite different with, let's say, the women major group or the NGOs, where you really see that very small organizations are active in the process. So it's more open, I would say. But I mean, as I said, that depends of the major group. Before UNEA starts, I mean, if we have that, if you have a physical meeting, often the weekend before, we have a global major group and stakeholder forum. That's also for the exchange of information. So people, often newcomers as well, they were not involved before. Then they get a kind of crash course on what's going on and etc. So the exchange of information, but also again in the preparation of the joint positions and inputs. That we are going to organize also for the UNEA to come, because we will have speaking slots, etc. So it's very important to know what we are going to say and not have a discussion at the floor. So we need to prepare this kind of points we want to raise during the meetings. There is also, what is very important is also to have working arrangements for the stakeholders, because it's not a big conference. I mean, there is a protocol. It's a member state negotiation. So you have a protocol for the member states, and you also have a protocol for the stakeholders, how to behave, what to do, when that you have to know when we are going to speak and how we are going to speak, how it works, where are we going to sit, etc. So that's things that will come back later as well. And we also have capacity building workshops. We also have a youth forum, which is also the same day or the day before. I mean, depending on the program of that year. And we also have the Science Policy Business Forum also the same day. So a lot of things are happening before UNEA, and for us it's very important to be there or be part. But I think what even is more important, that we did our homework before we go to Nairobi, so that you know what's on the agenda and what are the, let's say, the sensitive points to discuss with the other major groups. Next slide, please. But I think that's already the questions and answers.
Lida, thank you very much. You were very good in keeping to the time. Thank you. So we remain on schedule. I'd like to invite Felix and Jan Gustav back into active mode, and let's take a look at the questions. Okay. Let's see. We got here we go.
I think we'd like to answer the question of Lesja on the internet and the online.
If you're looking at it, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, because I think that's absolutely a concern. And now with COVID, that everybody seems to see the new normal, that everything is on Zoom and online and everything. I totally agree that that's another way of exclude people, because a lot of people are not on the internet. They don't have smartphones, laptops, whatever. So I think, yes, that is a problem. And so I think we have to raise that. It's already proven that in those online meetings, even within the CPR, etc., it's very difficult for NGOs to get in, even if you have your laptop and everything settled, because normally your advocacy you also do, I mean, vis-a-vis with the member states and the coffee breaks, etc. So the democracy and the participation of civil society organizations is getting less with all these Zoom meetings and online things. But I mean, the concern that you have that a lot of people are not on the internet is absolutely a fact and a concern.
Thank you, Lida. Here's one. How does the grassroots organization in rural and urban slums in developing countries get involved to mitigate this environmental challenges by way of capacity building?
I think what is important, let's say that you are in contact with bigger organizations that do have the capacity, and I'm not talking about the intellectual capacity, more about the human resources and the instrumental resources to be part of that. I think it's a kind of illusion to think that all civil societies in the world, which are millions, can be part of this process. So I think it's also about the subsidiarity principle. I mean, some things you decide very locally, some things you decide regional, national, even international, so that within your civil society, within the country, you divide your tasks, that some groups are really more into the implementations, others are really into the advocacy, etc. Of course, you have to maintain your contact, but I don't see it necessary that all very small groups working in the neighborhood are part of an international negotiation process. So I think there it's important that you also organize yourself on the national level. So you're parts of a national federation of whatever topic you're working on. In Europe, there are also a lot of European federations where they say, okay, we work on the national level, you work on the European level, and then there is also a division of tasks where some are also working on the international level. But of course, the communication is very important to have that in between you. But I think you have to organize it in the most efficient way you can do.
Just a small thing here. I mean, and we often do it by dropping into the term civil society, but the great thing about the major groups and other stakeholders approach is you get more space. The worry of using the term civil society is you end up with one space for everybody and then one for industry and one for government. So it reduces space. And so if your organization is doing gender issues, then you've got a very good avenue for a seat at the table through the Women's Caucus. Indigenous peoples are not part of civil society in any definition that I've seen. So they have a specific role, and we're very it's very difficult if we don't extend the terminology that people get left out. And scientists and academics, which is where I am at the moment, are not part of the term civil society. So when you're doing these things, the great thing about UNEP and about the SDG process is it gives at least 9 seats at the table as opposed to 2. It reduces the space for business to 1 of 9 or less. It ensures you have youth having a specific engagement of their own. And one of the problems around the financing for development process is they adopted the civil society process, and the older people never let young people present during the negotiations because they controlled that space. And the great thing with the SDG process is that young people have their own space to be able to engage. So the more we can protect the larger space, the better we get with specific, what are the gender specific things that are happening on pollution that we need to hear. We don't need to hear them as part of a civil society discourse. We need to hear them from women. We need to hear how the impact on vulnerable groups like children and youth, how they're feeling it, not what NGOs, older NGOs think they should be saying. So I think we have to be careful with our terminology.
And I just come in also and add to what both Felix and Lyda said, that this is very, very, very important. It was decided to expand the understanding of a non-governmental organization, as Lyda said, back at Rio in 1992, and we got the concept of the 9 major groups. But it took a lot of fighting for the 9 major group concept to be not only understood, but also respected and given space. It first was given space at the Commission on Sustainable Development, and we had to run campaigns saying 9 or none, because the tendency was to give civil society, as it was called, as Felix says, or the NGO community, a one voice, and then all these different diverse groups with different approaches and understanding of issues and values had to fight amongst themselves. So it is extremely important to be vigilant and safeguard this 9 opportunities. And there is unfortunately a tendency in many of the various parts of the UN now to try to limit the space. And unfortunately, some of the secretariats, and thankfully not in UNEP, do not know the history of this and what it entails to have the 9 major groups there. And as Felix says, be vigilant and be careful with use of the terminology. And just one more thing, there has been a number of the questions on accreditation. And it's an interesting thing because UNEA is a hybrid now that's got universal membership with 193 member states, but it's also, UNEP is still a subsidiary body under ECOSOC. So there may be conflict of accreditation understanding. Lyda said there is no acceptable definition of what an NGO is. But ECOSOC has something called the Resolution 1996-31, which gives a number of basic criteria by which you have to answer to become an accredited ECOSOC member. And if you have the ECOSOC status, you will have an easier way into most of the UN systems. But as Felix said, there is a different and separate accreditation process to UNEP, as you will find in other places like the climate areas and CBD, etc. So be aware of the formalities here and don't run across a stumbling block because you didn't understand what was there. Then contact us because we can help you there.
Yeah, just 2 quick things. One is you're running out of time to get accredited for UNEA 5, if you don't start now, if you haven't already got accreditation. UNEP came in and said that at the previous one we worked for on Asia. I have very little confidence that UNEA 5 will happen, you'll have longer. But if you haven't got accreditation, start that process now. It's quite simple not simple, it's never simple, but at least it's not a situation where you, like ECOSOC, it can take up to 2 or 3 years to get it. The issue of stakeholder and civil society, Jan Gustav and I did a book about this, which came out last year. I've put that in the chat box. The important thing in that is it gives you some great examples of policy development by stakeholders, partnership delivery by stakeholders as well, and why the importance of using stakeholder as the conceptual framework increases space for all of us to be able to have our unique space to engage in the process.
I'd just like to jump in the chat box. Our colleague Aurora from UNEP is with us. Aurora, great to have you again. She put in the link to accreditation. So if the participants want to copy that and save that and take a look at that. I'm going to say there's time for maybe a couple more questions before our break. There's a question about funding of people coming from abroad. Can you address that in terms of how people can get funding in developing countries and whatnot?
Come back on the funding in more general terms later, but I think on the participation in UNEA, there is always some funding. I mean, there's always a member state, although it's not guaranteed, that find it important that NGOs or civil society organizations, major groups are there. So when there is that funding, it's told by the civil society unit. They're also working hard to get funding for travels and accommodation for organizations. Once that it's known, there is a selection process on who is going to go. When it's earmarked, let's say, if it's only for African NGOs or Latin American NGOs, depending on the funding, then it's clear, of course, and then it's organized by the regional rep for that continent. So that you have a kind of criteria on who's going to go, etc. So that's something that is also self-organized as well. So therefore, it's the rep from your major group that is taking care of that. But if you are in contact with your regional reps, with your major group facilitators, then normally you receive the information if there is funding available and what the selection procedure will be for that funding.
Well, thank you for that. If anyone want to say anything else about that matter, or should we move on to another question? Do any of you
want to add, sorry, is that business and is often excluded from that funding. So it's only for NGOs.
Yeah.
Do any of you see questions that you feel compelled to jump in on? Because if not, there aren't really any new questions, just a few comments. So I would suggest we move on to our break period.